Hey everybody, my name is Daniel Marino and this is Karate Thoughts. So I've been a karate practitioner since I was a young child. I've been a karate teacher now for my entire adult life, and this is just a series where I talk about subjects that are related to karate. So it's been a while since I've done an episode, and there's been a lot on my mind. I've been writing about it elsewhere, and this subject has been a long time coming. I've wanted to make this video for a while, so I'm glad to sit down and finally do it. And the subject I want to cover today is just the concept of creating your own forms, of modern karate practitioners creating modern forms for our own practice. And obviously a large part of karate training, I would say fairly universally across the various styles, is that you have these traditional forms, Kata, Hyung, whatever term you use for them. And they're kind of shrouded in mystery, for most of them. We for many of these forms, we don't know who created them, where they come from, much less, how the movements found within them are supposed to be applied. It's very much a open kind of interpretive practice, right? If that information did exist in the past, with many of the forms, it's something that hasn't been passed down to us today. So it's kind of up to the individual practitioner to interpret the traditional forms and to come up with explanations for the movements. And although I think that, this is a worthwhile process in a lot of ways, I'm not suggesting that people should stop practicing the traditional forms entirely. I do think that there's a lot of value in just creating our own forms, because it removes this interpretive layer to the training process. All right, so there's a form. If you follow my content elsewhere online, I've been sharing something that's a daily part of my practice, is that I created my own form that takes some of my favorite techniques and arranges them in a symmetrical pattern. So the cool thing about this is, of course, that because it's my own creation, it's something I can apply much more directly to the other aspects of my training. The techniques that I'm doing in this form are the same ones that I use in sparring, and that I also can apply to other training exercises like bag work. It creates a lot of continuity, right? I have this little solo routine of movements that I can do anywhere that I go, I do it pretty much every day just in my living room. And the techniques that are contained in this form of mine, are the same things that I'm practicing in other aspects of my training when I have partners available and when I have training equipment available. So I think it's pretty cool, and I think it's really helped me to look at the concept of forms, kata, hyung, whatever term you want to use. It's helped me to look at the training practice itself kind of from a different perspective. So, the traditional forms in karate are, kind of shrouded in mystery. For many of them, we don't know who created them, much less what the meaning of the movements is supposed to be, how the techniques found in the forms are supposed to be applied against resistance. It's become, whether or not it originally was that way, for the traditional forms, in many cases, they've kind of become this interpretive practice where the individual practitioners interpret the movements and come up with explanations for them and then kind of apply them themselves. And what in Western karate circles is normally kind of termed bunkai. We use bunkai as like a blanket term to describe that process. And I think it's important to remember that even for the traditional forms, theoretically at some point there was someone that created them, right? So I think it's important that we don't make something out of them that they're not, that it's not there's no reason to think that there's something special about the traditional forms that we couldn't recreate today ourselves. I do think there's a lot of value to continuing to practice the traditional forms, but more so, it's a cultural value, an historic value, an aesthetic value. It's not as much for the functional side of things. I don't think that practicing traditional forms, and even with, kind of like a practical interpretation of the meaning behind the movements, I don't think that's a particularly efficient way to go about training and developing fighting skills. And I think that it's possible in the past that there was a clearer connection between the forms and the other parts of karate training, but that's been lost. Whether or not it ever existed is kind of open to interpretation. But if there were direct meanings for the movements of Nahachi, just to use an example, a traditional karate form, we don't have them today. So it's kind of just up to individual practitioners. And some of the early source material that we have, one of the books I'm really familiar with is Watashi no Karate Jitsu by Motobu Choki, published in 1932. And he explicitly talks about there being hidden meanings to Nahachi in that book. So there's even this concept that the movements, the way that we practice them, aren't even directly applicable, that there's some kind of a hidden meaning behind the movement that you're supposed to discern for yourself, or supposed to be explained to you by your teacher at some point, perhaps. And I think this fundamentally changes the practice, right? Because Motobu, to give an example, Motobu explicitly says that in the cross steps of Nahachi, where you step and you cross your legs, he said the hidden meaning behind that motion was that you were actually kicking your enemy, but the kick itself generally not being shown. So my point is just that when we look at these traditional forms, they're kind of interesting historical oddities. And we can look at the movements, we can interpret them, we can maybe even extract some good techniques out of them. But the whole process is pretty, indirect, like pretty convoluted. If we wanted to be more efficient in our training, I'd say that it makes sense just to create new forms where we know exactly what the movements are supposed to represent. It's very clear. There's nothing about it that's hidden. There's no hidden meanings. And therefore, it has that continuity where the form can be more directly connected to the other aspects of our training. I think it's really the best way to do it. And it's something that's still not particularly common in karate, I'd say, because there's this, not that it's unheard of, there definitely are many people that have created modern forms, that's not something at all unique, but it still isn't, I wouldn't say that it's the norm. And I think that's because there's kind of this attitude generally about kata that it's something that's special about it, because it's old and because it's traditional. There's something, the secrets that are found within the movements, or better or special, or something that we couldn't possibly come up with today. And I think that's fundamentally where I have a disagreement with the kind of cultural zeitgeist around the practice, is that I don't think that the traditional forms are something that are special in a functional sense. I think that we have resources available to us today that people in the past certainly didn't have, and we should make use of it. We can probably do a better job of creating forms that that teach combative skills and combative principles in a more direct way, because there's no need for interpretation. There's no issue of information being lost in time. So those are my thoughts on it. I really just think that it's something that more karate people should do. It's something I've really enjoyed incorporating into my practice. And there are even some aspects of it that I think are underappreciated, or were underappreciated by myself before I created this form and integrated into the practice, in that there's a creative expression of it. There's something that's kind of cool about having a form that I've created that has my preferred methods and is a representation of my approach to the art, and something that I can practice myself or present to others. I think it's, especially if we look back at the traditional forms historically, they're all created by someone at some point. And I think that maybe we have a tendency really to focus on application, on like the functional aspect, like how do I use this to actually fight, when I think that that's a subject, of course, that's important to consider and worth getting into, but you don't want to concentrate on it so much that you neglect kind of the other aspects of the practice, that this is a routine that's just for your health. It's just like a form of exercise that you can do anywhere that you have just a little bit of space. and it's also a creative expression for the martial artists that created the forms. And I think that, by engaging in that process myself, by creating my own form and making it something that I practice, it's a part of what I do. I think it's helped me to really appreciate the concept of forms in martial arts in a broader sense. So those are my thoughts on it. Thank you very much for watching. I would really like to get back to producing episodes like this more regularly, so stay tuned for more.